Magnus Carlsen is the all-time greatest player of the all-time worst chess opening in existence, 1g4, aka the Grob. It's the only opening move with which white can begin a game of chess that almost certainly loses by force. And yes, I did test this claim by making Stockfish play the Grob against itself, and yes, it did lose. But Magnus Carlsen does not lose when he plays the Grob. In fact, out of the 13 games I found on chess.com where he played this terrible opening, he won 12 of them and made only a single draw. Now, part of this is due to the fact that he more commonly reserves this move for much lower rated players, as is the case in the game we're going to be looking at today, played in late 2022, where he's up against the famous prodigy from Belarus, Denis Lazovic, who at the time of this game was only 15 years old. However, he was already quite strong and of grandmaster strength. He actually received his grandmaster title the same month that this game was played. So let's see how long this young genius can survive against one of the most fearsome Grob attacks that the world has ever witnessed on chess.com in a game of Blitz, executed by the world's greatest player. He begins with a strong and sensible response, d5, best in the position, getting him some of that center with a discovered attack on the g-pawn. So far so good. And here, the world's leading Grob apologists and scholars are kind of split between the moves bishop to g2, sacrificing the g-pawn in favor of piece activity, and the move now played by Magnus, h3, just defending the pawn. And this brings us to one of those atypical situations where immediately establishing the uncontested pawn duo in the center with e5, now played by Denis, is actually not the strongest move. The engine recommends an immediate h5, putting more pressure on g4. Nothing significantly wrong with e5 though. Magnus continues d3, activating his dark squared sniper. We get some normal looking development with knight to c6, bishop to g2, bishop to e6. h5 continues to be a good move for black, but Denis has probably never felt it necessary to study this opening with the computer. He's just going to rely on his traditional wisdom that says get your pieces out quickly, dominate the center, get your king castled, and then mercilessly punish your opponent for not doing the same. And this is a fine plan, in theory, but against Magnus, you better execute it with freakish precision or you're going to find the tables turning very quickly. We next have an objectively dubious move by Magnus, a3, just ignoring the whole central situation, though preparing a possible pawn thrust on the queen side, where he has correctly deduced that Denis will be castling his king. We have queen to d7, b4, and now f6, which looks a bit slow in a position like this. Castles or h5 would have been slightly better, but this is a fine move, just solidifying the center in anticipation of moves like knight to f3 or bishop to b2, now played by Magnus, applying pressure to e5, as the move b5 is on the cards to attack one of its defenders. We have knight g to e7, here comes knight to f3, at which point we do finally get h5. Still an excellent move, threatening to win the pawn on g4, threatening to activate the rook on h8. Magnus wants none of that noise, so he plays g5, the top engine move. Denis castles on the queen side. He's not too worried about a pawn storm on that side of the board. An immediate a4 would of course drop the pawn on b4. If b5, then the knight can be posted on a5 and then defended with b6 if necessary. The computer is saying that's losing for white, as are all of white's moves in this position. But Magnus is not fazed. This is exactly what he signed up for. He now flips that secret switch labeled engine mode, whose location on his body is still a mystery, and plays knight b to d2, supporting a possible c4. Denis responds knight to g6, a very good move, threatening to plop into f4. Magnus says nein, which translates to hindipo, as he plays e3, preventing it. This brings us to a moment of truth. There comes a time in every man's life when he needs to either take a stand and get up off the pot, or do what he sat down to do, as is often the case in these types of positions where one side is dominating the center and wondering at what point they should push one of their central pawns. It's not always obvious, even at the grandmaster level, as evidenced by Denis's failure to play his best move in this position, which is d4, whose main purpose is to prevent white from playing the move c4, as this would now drop a pawn to d takes e3, f takes e3, and queen takes d3. In the game, however, Denis instead throws away about 50% of his advantage with the move bishop to d6, allowing Magnus to get in the move c4. Now black is still the much better side and can remain that way if he plays something as simple as king to b8, getting his king a bit safer and just sort of maintaining the status quo. Denis now begins to go tragically awry, however, with the move queen to f7, Okay, he's putting some pressure on c4, clearing the way for a potential discovered attack on the white queen by the lurking rook on d8, a tactical idea which black is already threatening to put to use, beginning with the move e4. You can delve into that mess on your own if you'd like. But Dennis is just a day late and 3.27 rubles short because Magnus now strikes first with c5, attacking the bishop on d6. It drops back to e7, and now comes b5, attacking the knight. It goes to b8. The more active knight to a5 was playable as well, but the engine gives a bit of an advantage to white after bishop to c3, attacking the knight again, to which black's strongest response is actually bishop takes c5, sacrificing the knight. And that's another gopher hole that we could excavate for God knows how long, but I want to press on with Magnus's response, queen to c2, defending c5, which is attacked by black's bishop. Now, if Dennis had not moved his queen from d7 earlier, then it would most likely still be there, attacking the pawn on b5, which black could now capture with a still winning position, as opposed to a probably not winning position after the engine's top recommendation, rook h to f8, and a definitely not winning position after the move Dennis plays, d4. What Magnus should do now is just castle on the king side, but he decides to go queen side, which gives Dennis the chance to regain a moderate advantage with the move c6, attacking the pawn on b5, and if it's defended, he'll attack it again with a6. The goal is to pressure white into capturing on either c6 or a6 so he can reactivate his knight with the recapture. Now, if white had castled on the king side, then this plan would not be nearly as good for black, since then white could quickly bring his rooks to the queen side with some dangerous attacking prospects. What's played in the game is bishop to d5, pinning the knight to the bishop on g2. Now, you might have noticed that both sides have pawns that don't seem to be adequately defended here. Instead of playing bishop to d5, black could have just captured on g5, and that might even be better than what was played, but this would remove defense from the pawn on e5, which could then be targeted with knight to c4. Now in this position, white could go after black's d-pawn with e takes d4, but then the knight comes into f4. You don't really want to allow that, so what's played is h4, an inaccurate move. Apparently Magnus should have just captured on f6, and the reason, as far as I can tell, has less to do with pawn structure than it has to do with the fact that it's just a forcing move. Black would have to make the recapture, and then white can move again. The engine's recommending rook h to e1. But here, after the passively defensive h4, it's Dennis's turn to move, and he now finds the best one in the position, knight to d7, attacking c5 with the second piece. Magnus responds bishop to h3, pinning the knight to the king, but again, he should have first captured the pawn on f6. And the reason is that in this position, black can now get a winning advantage with the move not played in the game, f takes g5, exposing a double attack on the f3 knight. What's played in the game, in response to bishop to h3, is king to b8, unpinning the knight, and so once again threatening to take on c5, or on g5. Magnus finally sees the light and plays g takes f6. Dennis responds with the worst possible recapture, g takes f6, closing the f-file and so relieving some of the pressure on that f3 knight. Knight takes f6 was much better, with the idea of hopping into g4. Magnus continues with his strongest move, e takes d4. The pawn recaptures. Black's still threatening to take on c5, so Magnus removes the knight with bishop takes d7. And after rook takes d7, Magnus would love to go ahead and grab that pawn on d4 with his bishop. However, after bishop takes f3 and knight takes f3, queen to d5 would be quite nasty, hitting the knight, hitting the bishop, hitting c5, knight to f4 is on the way, and the white position is rapidly crumbling. So we have rook h to e1. c6 would have been a bit better, which is why black's best move is to now play c6 himself to prevent it, but Dennis either does not have a healthy respect for the move c6, or he's just not even thinking about it because he plays queen to f8, once again hitting c5 with two pieces. Magnus does play c6, officially equalizing the position, attacking the rook, which Dennis now moves to d8. We have queen to a4, defending a3, which is now attacked twice, knight to f4, attacking d3. Magnus defends with his king. Next is bishop to c5, adding some defense to the king side, which isn't looking as cozy as it could be. He's also adding some coverage to d4. It's of course not enough to save his d-pawn, which Magnus now captures with knight takes d4, but now there is the potential to capture white's most central minor piece on d4 if and when it becomes necessary. What black should play now is rook to g8, with the idea of going to g4, getting another piece lined up on d4, maybe grab the pawn on h4, but instead we have bishop to b6, clearing the way for the queen to come to c5 with check, where it can watch over the c6 square. And that does have some value, as we're going to see, but after Magnus plays c takes b7, black's best defense is not to recapture the pawn. Queen to c5 check is best at this point. Rook to g4 would be much better if it were possible. Dennis makes the obvious recapture though, with bishop takes b7, at which point Magnus misses his best move, and possibly his only winning one, knight to e4, preparing to play knight to c6, uncovering a double attack on the pinned f6 pawn. He's more focused on the king side though, and so plays the second best move, knight 2 to b3, hitting the c5 square and so rendering queen to c5 check unplayable. This also gives some more protection to the pawn on d3 by the rook in preparation for the move knight to c6, after which that d-pawn will be attacked twice. Dennis, now seeing that knight takes d3 is probably not going to happen, decides it's a good time to remove his knight from the potential view of white's queen on a4, and so plays knight to g2. A move which looks a bit odd in a position like this, but it is the engine's top choice, as it does come with an attack on white's rook. Magnus moves his rook to e6, adding some defense to the c6 square, which is where his knight will be landing in short order. Dennis plays rook to d6, a good move, challenging that rook. We have rook takes d6, queen takes d6, and now knight to c6 check. The knight is prudently removed, and after b takes c6, Dennis plays king to a8, clearing the way for a possible rook to b8 to defend against the possible queen to a6 followed by queen to b7 checkmate. Of course, queen to a6 isn't working for white yet, since black could just capture the pawn on c6. But if black's bishop were to move somewhere, that wouldn't be the case. c6 would be defended by white's queen. Magnus now pushes his d-pawn, blocking the threat of bishop takes pawn on f2. Now an excellent move for black in this position would be queen to d5, preventing white from pushing his pawn there, keeping an eye on c6, and preventing white from playing queen to c4 to defend his c6 pawn from a more active square. What's played in the game is the blunderous knight to f4. Magnus now seizes the opportunity to get his queen to c4. If queen to d5 is tried now, then white can just trade queens and play rook to e1 with the winning position due to his more active king and rook and back rank mating potential. What's played instead is knight to d5. Magnus plays rook to e1, we have a rook to d8, Magnus plays bishop to c1, looking to get his bishop to a more active diagonal, maybe go to d2 to prevent any knight to b4 check after he pushes his a-pawn. It's a winning plan, but Dennis now makes life much easier for him with a very severe blunder, queen to h2, giving Magnus a crushing tactic. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it. The move is queen takes d5. Recapturing with the rook is of course impossible, as that would allow white to force mate in two moves beginning with rook to e8 check. So we have queen takes f2 check, Magnus blocks with his bishop, Dennis now gets his rook out of danger with rook to b8, watching over the b7 square. We have queen to c4, ready to go to a6 at a moment's notice to threaten mate if the opportunity arises. Dennis captures the pawn on h4, because why not? It is a pawn. But now Magnus plays a4, threatening a5 to trap black's bishop. What can black do? Not a lot, and nothing that's going to save him. Playing a5 would allow white's queen into a6 with check. That's going to end poorly, and it actually forces mate after bishop to a7 and rook to e8. Dennis tries queen to g4, so that after a5 he can throw in a check, but after queen to d3, he's come to the end of the road. His queen's attacked, exchanging queens won't solve anything, his bishop will still be trapped, so we have queen to d5, the bishop falls, and now comes a move that makes zero sense, queen to d6. I'm assuming this was a mouse slip, and he really meant to play queen takes c6 with check, and so after b7 check from Magnus, we do have resignation, since black's only legal move is to sacrifice his rook. So I hope you enjoyed this masterclass in how to obliterate a prodigious young grandmaster with the worst opening of all time, played by the greatest player who's ever played it, Magnus Carlsen. Don't try this at home, save it for serious over-the-board tournament play, but do hit that subscribe button if you want to see more coverage of ridiculous chess games like this in the near future, and some more serious ones as well. Hit that like button if you liked the video, leave a comment with anything that's on your mind, and I will see you next time.